So those whole things, I'm going to start using this on my phone and see.
This is what's happening in our world at an alarming rate. Seemingly every single day there's something new. Our nation, Canada, as great as it seems on the outside, and our nation, Canada, as great as it seems on the outside and as wonderful it is, and we thought fairly safe to live in. By the way, the guy that did all did the shooting in Ottawa was buried in Libya. So it tells you where his heart was, and because he wasn't buried here in Canada.
He's putting it in their heads as they're scared.
And we have a world seemingly spiraling out of control, and Canada, for whatever reason, is infatuated with Europe. And I don't know if you've looked recently at what's going on in Europe and how really bad and how dark it is, but Canada has an infatuation with it. And 10 years ago, 10 years ago, they made social reforms that they're now regretting. I'm talking about Europe. So 10 years ago, they made all these social reforms in their countries that they're absolutely regretting right now. For example, the tolerance of the Muslim extremists and the Sharia law that they let be implemented in certain places in Europe that they're absolutely wishing they had never done. And by the way, it's knocking on the door of Canada.
Where in Europe did they implement Sharia law? Because Sharia law in itself would mean that the European governments, wherever, would be overthrown because it's a theocracy. Last time I checked, there is no Sharia in Europe.
So that was, especially in that time, so like 2014, 15, 6, 7 years ago, in that particular world of Christianity, there was this fear that, and probably still is that fear, but there's really hyper-focused on COVID right now.
Yeah.
This fear of Islam taking over, taking over in all these other places because we're not, because Europe has become more secular and they're not standing for Christian values anymore. Here comes this other faith to take over that's going to deceive a bunch of people.
But if they're not standing for Christian values, they're not going to stand for Jewish. They're not going to stand for Muslim because secular means not religious.
Yeah, and a lot of Europe is inclusive.
Yeah,
right?
they're
They
multicultural.
Multicultural, just like Canada is.
Amen. There are cities in England right now that are, the majority are Muslim. Brussels is by far a Muslim country now. Are y'all here?
You're not fooling me, bud.
And so it's almost like a conspiracy theory that they think that this is going to happen. And I'm sure there might be some groups that want to see Sharia law because they really feel like that's a strong thing, part of their faith. But
yeah.
There's plenty of groups that don't, Muslim groups that don't, right?
Yeah.
And that they leave their countries that impose that kind of law
to come here
so that they don't have to live under that, right?
Yeah.
But yet they can still hold on to their faith too.
Yeah.
So, it's this conspiracy theory to get you afraid, right?
Yep. Even more afraid. Because it's like, not even, is it just, here's the start with these fictional TV shows and Doomsday Preppers.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's, let's look at this in the culture. But there's a million things in cultures. Mm-hmm. Like, you can pick any bad thing that happens mm-hmm. almost and be like, end of the world.
And that's what they try to do.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the problem with that theology in of itself. But here's the other problem: is they have thought-stopping things. 2 Thessalonians 2:11. I looked this up because I have definitely forgotten where a lot of things are, so I had to, good old Google. But it talks about there will be mass delusion, right? That's a thought-stopping statement, right? There'll be mass delusion. So because these people want wickedness and these people want these bad things, so there'll be mass delusion, and God's going to allow the mass delusion to happen. So see, Europe is doing all these things, right? Because there's a mass delusion happening. You don't want to become that person part of that mass delusion. You want to be counted for standing for God, right? So that's the idea of what's happening here, right? So tells you to suspend your critical thinking of these issues and
Yep.
keeps you in it.
Yep. And then I think he moves on to euthanasia. I couldn't find, you said it was irrelevant earlier today. I couldn't find any of these statistics, so I'm just going to do a brief summary of.
Yep.
He talks about prostitution, this and that, just all these things that, make sense to point to. They're pro-life, obviously, which in reality is pro-birth.
Mhm.
And they use their stance as a way to say, doctor-assisted suicide is not the best choice. And, we can get into the discussion of that all for days. Okay? That's not an easy topic.
Let me give you, this is a Dutch experiment with assisted suicide. Proved that doctor-assisted suicide was impossible to effectively regulate. Euthanasia in the Netherlands is way out of control, this doctor said. He said the lessons are clear. This is what he said. Once you relax the law on euthanasia or assisted suicide, the number of people who will qualify for assisted suicide gets wider and wider. In 2013, a total of 42 people with severe psychiatric problems were killed by lethal injection. Are you hearing me? 14 in 2012, 13 in 2011. We have a world spiraling out of control. And these are the nations that Canada is infatuated with. And in fact, these are the very issues that we're grappling with right now as a society.
What are your thoughts on that? Pointing to progressive things.
Yeah, all these euthanasia, prostitution.
In December of 2013, France voted to make buying sex illegal. Do you know why? Because they legalized it, and it got so out of control that they had to change their law. And now, because it's so out of control and so many diseases are out of control, they're trying to turn back what they started. But how many know that once you start something, it's almost impossible to turn it back? And the move follows similar bans in Sweden and Norway, where other European countries are also scaling back their liberal prostitution policies. Because it got completely out of control and they didn't know what to do with it. Amen?
They think that they think these things are sinful. Okay? So because they think these things are sinful and that's their worldview and they see it through that lens, then it affirms some of the belief in their scriptures that talked about how people just want to give in to their wickedness and they just want to sin and they want to do these things. And so it's proof positive to them that, right, it's further confirmation bias to what their logical conclusion is. Never mind that, euthanasia, the purpose of it is to give people dignity in dying.
Yeah.
To end suffering.
Yeah.
Legalizing prostitution is protect workers.
Yes. Yes,
right?
I read a lot about that today when I was trying to find all these crazy statistics. Don't know where his sources are from. It basically said, they were stepping back on legalizing it because they needed to go. This is just a summary of what I've been reading and what I saw online. So in 2016, they started to put more laws in the area of prostitution because, you're starting to get the capitalist values. And it still increased the chances of, violence towards women, and so that's why they're re-looking at legalizing it. They're not completely illegalizing it. They're putting in certain laws and restrictions to help people.
To protect people.
Why does that matter?
Because if you see, in their mind is, if you allow certain things to be, it's like abortion, another issue, and it's a touchy, sticky subject, but they see things like those things, if they're legal in the books in the country, you're calling for yourself to have a quote unquote curse on your country.
Yeah.
Right. So you're allowing yourself to have the enemy to come in, allow that mass delusion to happen, and all these terrible things to happen, and that's where their fear comes in, because they don't want people to be deceived. They don't want people, they believe in hell. They don't want people to spend eternity without God, right? So they have that, there's a genuine level of caring somewhere there, but it's misguided in a lot of ways, right? It's based on faulty theology, faulty scholarship, and the like. And so, this is why it matters. It's why it matters so much to them. But when you start thinking critically about the issues, you realize actually these things are happening. These things happen to help people, to end suffering, to protect people, right? That's the goal with that. It's not because there's these evil people, that want to just allow evil things to happen. That's not what people want.
Yeah. So we've gone through the instilling fear. We're at the evidence part. So at this point, what is this doing to young minds? Like, I saw a lot of what looked like 12 to maybe 16-year-olds in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of adults too. But what is this doing to the kids?
So the youngest, unless you're like an infant not willing to stay in the nursery, is
Yeah.
probably 10 years old in that audience.
Oh.
So the impact is varying, but I like to focus specifically on the ones that have grown up with this kind of teaching, with rapture and end times, and being told that if you're going to go to hell if you don't believe in Jesus and all this kind of stuff, okay? Or if you don't believe in Jesus, by the time the rapture happens, you're going to be left here without your parents potentially, without without any kind of support to endure these terrible things that are going to happen that they're predicting, mass murders and killing and all this stuff. So the impact is, if you're growing up in this, and you're hearing this interpretation as a child, you're more, and as a child, you don't have the critical thinking skills to really battle against it. This is why so many kids believe in Santa Claus, right?
Yep.
But it's a pretty harmless thing for kids to believe in, right? It's like, God giving presents. But when they're older, we have no problem telling children, yeah, you're right. When they think critically enough and realize he's not real, you say, yeah, you're right, he's not real, right? We're able to have that rite of passage with children. But in this, when they get older, start thinking critically, they're met with, no, it's true. Don't you dare think outside of it. Don't you start doing this, or else you're on your way to hell, or else you're in danger of, missing the rapture, to escape this terrible tribulation that's coming. And so that's kind of what the goal of Siege is, to be honest. Siege is to kind of like warn these youth to say, turn to God. Don't do these
terrifying.
Don't have sex.
That's awful.
Don't drink.
Yeah.
Don't go to parties. Don't believe in evolution.
How many of those kids are growing up like this? And then when they grow up and are finally like, this is bonkers. You can't just go from being in it to then being like, you know what, I'm leaving, and being able to cope in society. That's why this bothers me so much. These kids are being set up to fail, in my opinion.
Yeah. And some often do find their way out and have a light bulb moment. Others, they have some real struggles. We talk about religious trauma in other podcasts. This is how it happens.
It's awful.
Right? This is how it happens, because you get taught a certain narrative since you're a child. And when you're a child and you believe something since you're a child, and you get told something different as you're an adult, it's hard to change and let go of that belief, right? Yep. Unless you're properly supported with your critical thinking skills, and you have people that can guide you as you get older, right?
Yeah.
To what's the truth. And that's the whole problem with this confirmation bias and all this stuff. You have this conclusion, and you go look for all these things to support your statements, but it really has you suspend your critical thinking. And I said that already, but I want to hammer that point home, and that's what leads to conspiracy theories, and believing conspiracy theories, and believing that, I don't want to take the COVID vaccine. Bill Gates is putting microchips in their COVID vaccine,
Yeah. Like, it's okay. Like,
Because it wasn't just Third Day that said this.
Oh, no.
Francis has said this. Third Day has said this. But other churches have said this too.
Yep.
You know, so
We can sit here until we're blue in the face being like, these people are crazy. Like, just don't worry about it. No, you have to worry about it because there's kids who are growing up in this and they don't have a shot.
mm-hmm.
And that, like what Richard Dawkins has said, that offends me when they don't get a proper education and they have to somehow figure it out when they grow up.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important.
And it's a process,
Yep.
and your identity gets wrapped up in it, and you have to find yourself again. You really do.
So now what I feel happens in part 3 of this, we've got creating fear, showing the quote unquote evidence, and now this is what I just called it, creating enemies. So they do a video, and I'm just going to summarize it, asking people, you know, do you think it's the end of days? They went to some Queen students, they went to people in the church, and I think at one point I saw, at the first clip, I think is a woman at the bookstore, the Queen's bookstore.
Yeah.
So we went around the streets here locally, and we just simply asked this question: do you believe that we're in the end of days? So here's what people in Kingston said, including right here in our own church.
But it's not the end of the world. I think it's just a matter of finding kindness in the world. I heard an expression a while back, and it's stuck with me ever since, that if you can't find kindness, be kindness.
We're in the last days because the Bible says that the Jewish people, the lost tribes, would come back to Israel, and they're coming back in groves. They're being airlifted. Yes, they're being supported by Christians, which is another prophetic word that the Christians and the Jewish people would come together.
And so we live in a world where the church no longer even talks about the rapture or catching away, but the world's talking about it all the time.
What are your thoughts on that? We no longer talk about the rapture, but the world talks about it all the time.
He's made that comment so many times over the years, and you know, he's so focused on that. You know, when he came to faith was in the 80s, and it was the height of there was a real belief in scare. You know, they had the Soviet Union and all that stuff, and the nuclear arms race and the Cold War and all that, and they had this belief because he grew up Pentecostal, or got saved Pentecostal. So they had this belief that this rapture was coming because there was a book written talking about how it was happening 40 years after. They used some obscure Bible verses taken out of context to make this point, that 40 years after Israel became a nation state. So 40 years, so they became a nation state in 1948. 40 years after that, it's 1988. The book written, 88 Reasons. Jesus coming back in 88. Of course, when 89 hit, there was a sequel, 89 Reasons. He was coming back. But see, but then people started to rework it. Oh, maybe that's not what it actually meant. Maybe it was something different, right? And so they came up with different reasons why it didn't happen. And so here he is trying to say, you know, there's big parts of, you know, the church as a whole. So think of every denomination you can think of, he's calling church, that doesn't believe it anymore, you know, or doesn't talk about it anymore. But there are actually a big number of churches that still do talk about it.
Yeah.
But the secular world is not talking about it. Like, they're not. And I don't know where he gets that idea, why he feels like that's something to talk about. I know he likes to say, you know, they point to the different TV shows again, but like, it's not talking about,
Sorry,
about it.
I'm too feisty on this right now. But anyway, no.
But that's you know, that's where it's coming from. That's where his ideas come from. That's why he says the church doesn't talk about it anymore, because there was a big hype in the 80s, like so much so that the TDN, the Bible Network in the States, they had something called rapture practice, where people would, the TV would pause and people would go and like jump on trampolines to practice getting caught up in the air. Like, people did this stuff.
I'm sorry. I'm
It
trying not to
sounds
be insensitive,
ridiculous.
but it's just, you have one life. And if this is why it makes me so angry to see people indoctrinating other people and taking their lives away. That's why this frustrates me so much. You have one life and you are stealing their lives. That's why this is happening. That's why we're not going to stop talking about things like rapture anxiety. And I've seen him on stage, if I can find this clip, I will, laughing about his kid freaking out when he came home and saw piles of laundry on the floor because he thought he was left behind.
I've told this story before, but one time our oldest son, Serge, who did not always walk the way he should walk, came home, and for some reason, there was clothes laid out that made it look like somebody had just left them there. And it just looked like somebody had, I don't know what happened, but there was clothes there that looked like somebody just stepped out of. So he walks in, and there's clothes there. And he goes, Mom, because listen, the best thing you can do when your kids get to be teenagers, hammer them with the rapture. Let them know Jesus could come at any moment. It just puts a little fear in them there, just Jesus could come at any moment. Don't you dare sin. And Mom, I'm just kidding, by the way. Don't send me letters. I've got enough of them. Mom, Dad, it's not, we should have been home. Mom, Dad, we were in the closet the whole time. No, we weren't. Dad, do you remember that? He was terrified. Do you know why? Thought the rapture had happened. And he thought he missed it. It did something to him. We need to go back to those days where we're aware of the return of the Lord. It should be an urgency, because if it's an urgency, you're going to hear this on Sunday. Then you're going to go in 40 days, Nineveh. God's given you a second chance, Nineveh.
That's not normal. That's not something to laugh at. You are, to use a term from Dr. Winnell, that's psychological terrorism. This woman
Absolutely
has a PhD in psychology, so I'm going to use her term.
Mm-hmm.
That is psychological terrorism. And
It
why
absolutely-
this is allowed
absolutely.
to happen and why it's funny, you're messing with your kids' health. You're messing with adults' health.
You're
First of
telling
all-
him that kind of joke, because that's actually a popular joke in that world, of that church world, okay? It's happened at camps and all sorts of things. Parents have done it to their kids. He's not the only one that has done it. But what you're teaching that child in that moment is to be afraid that they don't have the people that provide for them around anymore, and that they're alone.
And I think actually the Herald Camping Group is celebrating that Jesus is coming back. But nevertheless, there's a serious aspect of this that we want to also address, and that is this whole phobia indoctrination, and which is what I really would call terrorism. And terrorism is defined as the use of violence or threat of violence to control. And in that sense, if you teach the fear of hell, even if you're just using images, still those images are quite real. And you have images of Armageddon, you have images of rapture and being left behind. Those are terrifying images. They're terrifying, especially to small children. And so that, by definition, is terrorism. And so if we have millions of people in this country that are hammering this kind of fear into small children's heads, what we basically have is millions of terrorists. And so there's a consequence for that. And then in psychology, which is my field, you look at something like the fear of abandonment, and that's very serious. Okay, there's the violence. Okay, you think about hell and hellfire and all those images that get pounded into children. But then there's this fear of abandonment, this threat of abandonment. And you have to understand that the human being, when humans are born, we're helpless. Human infants are completely helpless. They do not survive without parental care. They're not like other mammals, they're not like other animals that can just continue on their own and take care of themselves and survive. We need about 2 years worth of very close care. And so it's built into our genes to have a life and death relationship with the notion of abandonment. It's a very deeply terrifying. So when you talk about being left behind, that's a horrible threat.
Of course that's terrifying. Of course that's scary. Especially if you've been taught this since you're a child and you're told how terrible it's going to be after.
And like to walk in, like I'm thinking just if that happened to me as a kid, I'd be like, oh my God, it's because I lied to my friend this morning. And these people have become obsessive. I've heard podcasts of, I think it may have been Dr. Clint Haycock. They'll be like, oh my gosh, I lied to someone. And they'll immediately go to their bedroom and start repenting and be like, okay, I'm not going to have dessert anymore for this entire week. And
they'll fast.
This is kids though. Again, you are stealing their lives. We have so much information to show what the impact of things like this have on kids. So why are we letting it happen? I'm all for religious freedom, and I sound radical because I've been invested in this for 7 months now, but it's time for us to start making laws because this is ruining people's lives.
And it's hurting children, and children are vulnerable people. We need to protect vulnerable people. Absolutely. And see, they justify it though in that church because they believe that people are born wicked and deceitful, and without Jesus, you can't do anything good.
Nope.
Right. So that's why they're okay with that. That's why they're okay with doing that, because you better put the fear of God in them.
So sad.